Professor Sachs is a world-renowned economist and professor, best-selling author, innovative educator, and global leader in sustainable development. He's widely recognized for bold and effective strategies to address complex challenges, including debt crises, hyperinflations, the transition from central planning to market economies, the control of AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, the escape from extreme poverty, and the battle against human-induced climate change. He's exercised multiple roles at the United Nations related to this work on sustainable development and the SDGs. And in fact, he's got an appointment right after this back at the United Nations. From 2001 to 2018, Professor Sachs served as special advisor to 3 successive UN Secretaries General. He's widely considered one of the world's leading experts on economic development, global macroeconomics, and the fight against poverty. His work has taken him to more than 125 countries, and for more than 30 years, he's advised dozens of heads of state around the world and 2 popes. Prior to joining Columbia, Professor Sachs spent over 20 years as a professor at Harvard University, where he just received his BA, his MA, and PhD degrees. Professor Sachs has authored and edited numerous books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers, and most recently, the title, A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism, which was published in 2018. Professor Sachs was the co-recipient of the 2018 Blue Planet Prize, the leading global prize for environmental leadership. Currently, Professor Sachs serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he's also a university professor, Columbia's highest rank for academics. Just to give you a few brief quotes, the New York Times called Sachs probably the most important economist in the world. Time magazine has called him the world's best-known economist, and a survey by The Economist considered him among the 3 most influential living economists.
Hi, everybody. I appreciate the chance to be with you to talk about sustainable development and the fact that you're studying it and interested in it, and you're going to have to solve a lot of problems also, because the problems are not going away anytime soon, and you're going to be in positions of responsibility pretty soon, and it's not going to be absolutely simple. This is a good neighborhood that you're in, because I just walked from the UN to here. You're in kind of the center of global diplomacy at the Lycée, and I was at a meeting this morning at the UN that I think is a good place for us to start the discussion. It was with a senior UN official who's been asked by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to help plan a summit this September. It'll be September 21, 22, 23, Saturday through Monday, on climate change. And the question, the hard question, is how can we get the world's politicians and governments doing the right thing to solve this climate change crisis? So this is an important meeting, but it's a meeting among many meetings, none of which has fully made the breakthrough to putting us on a safe path for the climate in 2030, 2040, 2050 in the world. And we're not safe right now, as we see every day with strange things happening on the planet. Huge hurricanes, huge forest fires that are unprecedented, massive heat waves, big swings in temperature that are related to kind of an extra loopy jet stream, which itself is related to the changes taking place in the climate system, because the Arctic is warming faster than New York, so the difference is shrinking. And as the difference shrinks, the dynamics of the jet stream change, and that's why we're having weirder and weirder weather in our band of the latitudes. So we're already in danger, but trying to find the way forward has not been simple. And I think it's appropriate for the Lycée, obviously, that the operative global framework that we're trying to implement right now is the Paris Climate Agreement. This is hard work and not entirely successful. And even the Paris Climate Agreement is an agreement to implement another agreement which was reached back in 1992, a treaty called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We've been at this for a long time without solving the problems. So already back in 1992, the world's governments said, we have a climate crisis. And as you're studying, the climate crisis is due to us. And so all of you know a lot more than the President of the United States, that's for sure, because he doesn't even know that, or he pretends not to know that, or he doesn't care about that. So already we're in a little weird world with the White House either ignorant of this or pretending that it doesn't matter. But we've known globally for decades that when we burn coal, oil, and gas, that emits carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and just by bad luck of chemistry, carbon dioxide, when it's in the atmosphere, traps heat. And that's just quantum mechanics. It's accidental. It's not because anything is immoral about coal, oil, or gas per se. It's just that it happens to have this chemical side effect, which, by the way, was first discovered in the 1870s, so even Donald Trump should have heard about it by now. But he hasn't, or pretends not to. So we're burning a lot of coal, oil, and gas for our cars, to heat buildings, to run industry, and it got out of hand already decades ago. So much use of fossil fuels that we've put so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we've already warmed the planet. The climate scientists tell us that the planet is already about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than it was 125 years ago, which they take to be what's called the pre-industrial temperature. So we've already had warming of 1.1 degrees. It may not sound like a lot per se, but when you look at the Earth's history, we're now warmer on average, or year by year, than the Earth has been for any decade since the last 10,000 years. So since agriculture started, civilization, we're now warmer than that whole period. And that means that we're already in a climate that is different from what humanity grew up with, what our crops grew up with, what biodiversity, the plant life, food supplies, how our cities are built, precipitation patterns, all of that is now already dangerously changing. Well, all of that was known, kind of, at least by the specialists, in 1992. And governments got together at a conference in Rio de Janeiro that became known as the Earth Summit, and they agreed on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the idea of that Framework Convention said that all of the countries of the world agreed, and here's the formal way they put it, to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in order to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. So to unpack that, stabilize the concentrations of greenhouse gases, the gases that trap heat and warm the planet. And to do it in order to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference. Anthropogenic means human-caused interference in the climate system. In other words, in 1992, don't mess up the climate system. Don't let CO2 rise to a level, or the other greenhouse gases. What's another greenhouse gas, for example? methane, nitrous oxide, fluorine gases. There are 6 or 7 major greenhouse gases, but by far the most important is CO2. Don't let these concentrations rise to create dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. Too late, because that was 27 years ago, and we didn't do very much. And it's really interesting also to ask why we didn't do very much, and unfortunately, the United States is a very big culprit in this story. In 1992, when the agreement was reached, in an annex to the agreement, there was a list of countries, cleverly called Annex 1 countries, and the countries listed in that annex were basically the rich countries of the world, including the United States. And the treaty said, let's be fair. We have to stop emissions of carbon dioxide, but we should do it in a fair way. Let Annex 1 countries start the process. They're the richest, they've got the most technology, the most alternatives. It's not us, the poor countries, that made this mess. So let the rich countries start. And that was signed and even ratified by the US Senate in 1992. And then a funny thing happened in this country, which is not ha-ha funny, just weird funny. And that is that in the mid-90s, our country lost its mind, basically, in any kind of responsibility to the rest of the world. And in 1997, 2 senators, Robert Byrd and Chuck Hagel, put a resolution to the US Senate called the Byrd-Hagel resolution that said, we, the Senate, will not support any moves under the Framework Convention that do not also compel the developing countries to do the same thing or to take obligations. And you have to look at that and say, duh, you just ratified the treaty. The treaty says Annex 1 countries go first. But senators are senators. So they did something completely contradictory to what they had ratified, really unfair, really selfish, and by a vote of, drumroll, 95 to nothing. So this wasn't some small thing. This was just general American bloody-mindedness, which is we're not going to be fair to the world. Why? Because America has a kind of neurosis about China, and the idea was, why should we do anything if China's not doing something? And at the time, China was a lot poorer and was emitting a lot less CO2 per person, and China said, well, excuse me, the treaty says, Annex 1, thank you, after you. And the United States said, no, we'll do it together. And China said, read the treaty. And that was very intelligent diplomacy on all sides. And of course, nothing happened. So the Kyoto Protocol was signed, and then President Clinton at the time never sent it to the Senate. And because he knew the Senate wouldn't ratify it, because under US constitutional law, a treaty has to be ratified by the Senate. So it was never sent to the Senate. And then I had a weird experience in 2001. I was in the White House actually about AIDS, not about climate change. And the guy looked at me and said, oh, Professor Sachs, I have to go across the street to formally pull the United States out of the Kyoto Protocol. And so I witnessed that little footnote of a footnote of a footnote of history, because what had happened was Al Gore had signed as vice president in Kyoto but never ratified. And then George W. Bush came in and said, we're just out of this. Don't even think we're ever going to ratify this. We formally pull ourselves out. Well, to make a long story a little bit long, this kept going. We didn't agree on anything. Nobody really slowed down. In the meantime, China had the biggest economic increase of any country in the history of the planet. It's a big country. It had rapid economic growth. They burned a lot of coal to do it. And so China became the biggest emitting country in the world, took over the US front rank around 2009. And in 2009, President Obama was elected president, and then they thought, okay, now we'll reach an agreement, and nobody did much homework, and they went to Copenhagen for one of these annual summits. That was called COP15. COP means Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention. And they went to Copenhagen, and President Obama said, let's sign, and the Chinese said, no, thank you. You're Annex 1, we're not Annex 1. The whole thing was replayed, and the thing failed. But it was kind of another duh moment, which is if you want to do something complicated, you have to do a little bit of preparation. And in America, all first-year presidents are not competent, almost without exception in our history, because there are a few exceptions, but it takes time to learn how to do this anyway. So President Obama started diplomacy after that with China, and that brought us to Paris, December 2015, when through really very, very, very skilled diplomacy, what we'll do is the following. The Paris Climate Agreement says we should keep warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Remember, we're already at 1.1. They didn't define what well below means, but people interpret it as meaning something like 1.7 degrees or 1.8 degrees Celsius. And we will aim to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, there's a big problem. Also, I don't think the diplomats really understand very much what they agreed to anyway. But there's a big problem with the 1.5. There's a big problem with all of it, which is that we're at 1.1 degrees warming. But we're not done warming even up to the greenhouse gases that we've already emitted. Because when you put CO2 into the atmosphere, the Earth doesn't suddenly warm. It creates an energy imbalance, and it takes time for the warming to reach the new equilibrium based on how much CO2 is in the air. So we're in that process of catching up with the emissions that we've already put in the air. If we didn't put any more CO2 in starting today, we'd still have the temperature rising by how much? No one knows for sure, of course, but maybe another 0.3 degrees, maybe 0.4 degrees. Maybe we'd even exceed 1.5 degrees without one more ton of CO2 put in the air as the feedback effects finally work their way through and we reach the new balance. So to reach the Paris goals, we have to stop emitting greenhouse gases like now. That's not possible, except if we turned off all the electricity, turned off the microphone, turned off our phones, turned off the computers, stopped driving cars, stopped heating our buildings. We've got a lot of built-in momentum also of fossil fuels, so it takes time to change the economy. To me, the image that comes to my mind is that we're in an airplane and it's really turbulent. And we're in the middle of a thunderstorm. It's extremely dangerous. And the pilot really needs to land. And suddenly you break below the 10,000 foot level and you see a runway, or you know there's a runway 10 miles ahead or 15 miles ahead or however many it would be at 10,000 feet. And you say, I gotta land this thing, and I'm gonna have one chance to land this thing. And I'm running out of fuel anyway because I've been circling because of this storm long enough. We've run out of time. We got to make that landing. That is roughly where we are if we want to stay with climate safety. And so my discussion this morning is, what does that final trajectory look like? Because there are not actually a lot of choices. The pilot can't say, let's fly to Florida instead. Let's choose a different, let's go back up, let's choose a different plane. let's start over again. Maybe we shouldn't have taken off. Those are not very relevant if you want to land the plane safely. So we're, in my view, just on the final landing. And there is a safe landing possible. But we have to decide we're going to do it. And what is that safe landing? The basic idea is that within the next 30 years, we have to get out of the business of coal, oil, and gas. And there are a few footnotes to that statement, but that's basically the point. The one footnote I would add is there's a fancy technology called carbon capture and storage, where you would burn coal, oil, or gas and capture the carbon dioxide and put it underground somehow. And that could work because you don't emit CO2, but it's pretty expensive and it can't be the main way that we're going to stop emitting 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. The safe path is go to wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, maybe nuclear, as controversial as that is, but it will have its role. There are a few other energy sources, maybe a little bit of bioenergy, but if you do that, you end up chopping down a lot of trees to try to grow crops for biofuels, so it's probably not a good idea. And get out of the fossil fuel business within 30 years. And that's what we were talking about this morning. How could you get governments to do this? And my main suggestion in practice is show them that it's feasible. So nothing very exalted, but show here is your landing path. Here is what you could do. Here is what will bring safety for the planet. And I'll give you a good example. California is the state in the United States farthest along on this safe landing because they've been at it for 20 years. They have a legal structure. They just passed another law, which the outgoing governor, Jerry Brown, signed, that says that all of the electricity in the state should be carbon-free by 2045. So they're actually doing it, one of the most sophisticated economies in the world. So not some, some special case. It's California would be one of the biggest countries in the world if it were a country by itself. And they're actually doing this. And they're going for what they call ZEVs, zero-emitting vehicles, which is Tesla and other plug-in electrics or other technologies. They're going for building retrofits so that instead of oil to burn for heating the buildings, you use heat pumps, which is an electric-based technology. And for all of these sectors, you get a timeline for how you're going to move to the clean electricity. You know what? It actually works when you try to figure it out. You really find you can land this thing. This is not crazy stuff. This is really timely. Thank goodness the engineers are very clever. They figured out a lot of ways to do this without coal, oil, and gas. And my assumption is that if it weren't for the oil and gas companies, if it weren't for the politics around oil, coal, and gas by the major oil and gas and coal countries, we'd figure this out. We'd say, yeah, oh, thank God. If we were told, for example, we're running out of this stuff, then, which we're not, then we would have a clear shot. We'd know what to do. So I view it as mainly politics rather than lack of good options. But politics is not a great reason to wreck your future, actually. It's a lousy, stupid reason. We shouldn't be in the business of making ExxonMobil just a little bit richer so that you face a horrible future. And that's the kind of choice that we're facing right now. And that's the battle that we're really in, as I interpret it. So there are maybe 10 countries that really have a decisive role in this because they're the ones that produce most of the CO2. And the United States is one, China's a second, India is a third, European Union, the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and the other countries of the Gulf where there's so much oil and gas, Canada, which has huge oil sands in this province of Alberta, Australia, which has huge coal deposits, which it sells to China, to Japan, and to Southeast Asia, and not very many others, actually. So it's not 193 governments that need to be convinced, it's about 10, but 10 big, major, heavy countries.